The 1970s were supposed to be all about disco, roller skates, and bell-bottoms, but Saturday mornings had their own flavor of chaos. Cartoons weren't just colorful entertainment. They were bizarre experiments, strange hybrids of pop culture, and sometimes downright confusing fever dreams. So here's a question. What happens when animators with too much imagination and too little restraint get a time slot to fill? You get some of the weirdest cartoon characters ever created. And trust me, a few of them are still hard to believe were real. Uglor, Space Sentinels, 1977. Imagine a villain that looked like he wandered out of a forgotten monster flick and accidentally crash-landed into a Saturday morning cartoon. That was Uglor. Green-skinned, ape-like, with giant bat wings sprouting from his back and eyes that shot lasers for no clear reason. He wasn't just weird to look at. He acted bizarrely, too, half blundering buffoon, half terrifying brute. Uglor was the recurring bad guy in Space Sentinels, a Filmation series about 3 young superheroes who protected Earth. While the heroes had futuristic powers, Uglor felt like a leftover idea from a pulp comic book. He shouted, he schemed, and yet he never really pulled off a victory. The strangest part? His wings barely flapped, yet he always managed to stay airborne. For kids in the 70s, Uglor was unforgettable. He was scary enough to leave an impression, but silly enough to make you laugh. Looking back, it's almost like the creators mashed together King Kong, a bat, and a Saturday Night B-movie villain, then cranked the weirdness up to 11. And somehow, he became the face of menace for the entire show. Hong Kong Phooey, 1974. Only in the 70s would someone pitch, let's make a dog a martial arts superhero. That was Hong Kong Phooey, a janitor dog named Penry who jumped into a filing cabinet, spun around, and came out as a karate-chopping hero. But here's the twist. He was absolutely terrible at his job. Voiced by the legendary Scatman Crothers, Phooey would try every kung fu move in the book, usually fumbling them all. And somehow, thanks to pure luck or his cat sidekick Spot, the bad guys still lost. The theme song promised wild action, but what you got was a comedy of errors wrapped in chop suey 70s stereotypes. The character became a cult favorite because he was so over the top. He drove a Phooey-mobile that transformed into different vehicles at random, carried around a Hong Kong book of kung fu to remind him what to do, and still never really learned. He was both a parody and a hero at the same time, which made him stand out in a sea of caped crusaders. For kids, Phooey wasn't about martial arts, it was about laughing at someone who couldn't stop messing up. And that's why this clumsy, good-hearted dog still has a place in Saturday morning history. Batfink, 1972. Your bullets cannot harm me. My wings are like a shield of steel. That line burned itself into the memory of every kid who ever stumbled across Batfink. This was a short cartoon series originally made in the 60s, but it hit reruns in the 70s and became one of the strangest superhero shows on TV. Batfink was, quite literally, a bat superhero. He wore a bright red suit, had steel wings that deflected attacks, and flew around with his karate-chopping sidekick, Karate. Yes, that was the sidekick's actual name. The duo faced villains so absurd they made Batman's rogues gallery look normal. One bad guy was named Hugo A. Go-Go, a mad scientist who acted like a cartoon sketch. Another episode featured villains whose plans were less about crime and more about being silly for the sake of filling time. But the weirdest part wasn't just Batfink's powers, it was how seriously he took himself. The show treated his corny one-liners like gospel. For kids, that made the whole thing hilarious. Looking back, Batfink feels like a parody of superheroes before parody was even the point. And yet, his Steel Wings catchphrase is still one of the most bizarre relics of 70s cartoon culture. Mr. Jaw, 1976. A giant shark in a bowler hat. That alone should tell you everything you need to know about Mr. Jaw. This strange blue shark was clearly inspired by the Jaws craze of the mid-70s, but instead of being scary, he sounded like a gangster straight out of the 1920s. Mr. Jaw chased after swimmers, boats, or pretty much anything that moved, all while wisecracking in a gravelly voice. He was joined by a little sidekick named Catfish, who mostly existed to laugh at his boss's misadventures. The show was produced by De Patti Freleng, the same studio behind the Pink Panther, so it had that quirky slapstick style. The oddest part was the tone. Sometimes Mr. Jaw was scary enough to make kids nervous, but then he'd slip on seaweed and turn into pure slapstick comedy. He wasn't menacing, he wasn't heroic, he was just there, a confused mashup of trends designed to cash in on shark mania. Looking back, Mr. Jaw is less a character and more proof that studios would throw anything at the screen if they thought kids might watch it. And for some reason, kids did. Clips of Mr. Jaw today feel like they were animated by someone who couldn't decide if they were making a monster, a comedian, or just a really weird fish. Doggy Daddy. Yogi's Ark Lark, 1972. You'd think a Hanna-Barbera cartoon about animal heroes saving the planet would be straightforward. But throw in Doggy Daddy, and suddenly the show turned bizarre. Originally introduced years earlier as Augie Doggy's overprotective father, Doggy Daddy resurfaced in the eco-themed Special Yogi's Ark Lark. The story followed Yogi Bear and a boatload of Hanna-Barbera characters sailing around looking for the perfect place. But while others were trying to save wildlife and escape pollution, Doggy Daddy was obsessed with keeping Augie safe from every possible danger. He wasn't just protective, he was helicopter parenting before the phrase even existed. Whenever Augie got close to adventure, Doggy Daddy swooped in with his exaggerated accent and corny warnings. It made him stand out as both unintentionally funny and weirdly out of place in a show that was supposed to be about saving the Earth. For viewers, Doggy Daddy turned what could have been just another environmental message cartoon into something stranger. He didn't care about pollution or nature. He just wanted to shield his kid from everything. And that odd mismatch made him one of the most bizarre faces in Hanna-Barbera's sprawling lineup. Brack, Space Ghost. When you hear galactic villain, you probably imagine something terrifying and calculating. But Brack? He was the opposite. Introduced in Space Ghost and recycled endlessly in the 70s, Brack looked like a fearsome alien pirate, giant fangs, a mask, striped armor, but acted like a confused goofball who barely understood his own plans. The strange part was how he constantly bounced between threatening and ridiculous. One moment he'd roar in his booming villain voice, and the next he'd be mumbling nonsense that made no sense at all. It was like he forgot he was supposed to be evil. Kids didn't exactly fear Brack, they laughed at him. And while he was designed to be a serious rival to Space Ghost, the sheer silliness of his lines turned him into accidental comedy. That weird mix eventually became so popular that decades later, Brack returned in spoof shows as a full-on parody character. Looking back, Brack was bizarre because he wasn't scary, wasn't smart, and wasn't even consistent. He was just Brack. And somehow, that weirdness made him unforgettable. Fangface, 1978. Take a teenage boy, mix in a werewolf curse, and add Saturday morning slapstick. That was Fangface. Every time this lanky teen named Sherman saw the moon, he transformed into a toothy, goofy werewolf. But instead of being terrifying, Fangface was just as clumsy and clueless as his human form. The formula was predictable but entertaining. Teens travel around in their vans solving mysteries. Fangface sees the moon. Chaos erupts. He'd smash walls, chase after shadows, or bumble his way into accidentally catching the bad guy. The whole thing felt like Scooby-Doo with a werewolf, except Scooby never tried to eat the suspects. The oddest detail? Fangface kept his same teenage voice even after transforming, so you'd hear a regular kid tone coming out of a furry monster. That disconnect made him more laughable than frightening. For viewers, Fangface was bizarre because he lived between horror and comedy, never fully fitting either one. He was both the danger and the comic relief, which turned him into one of the strangest heroes of the late 70s cartoon lineup. Captain Caveman, 1977. Few cartoon intros hit as hard as the one where a giant club-wielding caveman bursts out of a block of ice, screaming, "Captain, Caveman!" That was the hook, and it worked. But the character himself? Pure Saturday morning oddity. Captain Caveman, or Cavey as the teen angels called him, was a hairy prehistoric man with a club that hid everything from bats to helicopters. He solved mysteries in the Scooby-Doo style, but his methods were anything but subtle. Usually, he just smashed through the problem yelling nonsense. The weirdest part wasn't even his gadgets, it was his constant shouting and mumbling. Half the time you couldn't understand what he was saying, and the other half he was pulling impossible items out of his club like it was a magician's hat. For kids, that unpredictability was gold. You never knew if Cavey would save the day or make it worse. He wasn't smart, he wasn't graceful, but he was loud, chaotic, and unforgettable. And that's exactly why Captain Caveman still stands as one of the strangest creations of the 70s. Shazan. The premise alone screams bizarre. Two American teens find halves of a magic ring, say Shazan, and suddenly summon a 60-foot-tall genie. Sounds epic, right? But here's the catch. Shazan could do absolutely anything except send them home. Each episode followed the same rhythm. Teens get into trouble, call Shazan. The genie shows up, laughs thunderously, and saves the day in seconds. He could fly, teleport, turn villains into dust, you name it. But somehow he never got them back to their own time. The kids rode around on Kabooby, a flying camel, solving problems that were usually solved in under a minute once Shazan appeared. For viewers, the character was both awe-inspiring and oddly frustrating. Why was an all-powerful genie incapable of one simple request? That contradiction is what made Shazan bizarre. He was limitless, yet useless at the one thing that mattered. He existed only to show up, laugh, and wave problems away. And in the landscape of 70s, cartoons that made him one of the strangest characters to ever thunder across the screen. Speed Buggy, 1973. What if Scooby-Doo was a car? That's basically Speed Buggy. Instead of a talking Great Dane, you had a bright orange dune buggy with a stuttering voice and a habit of inserting himself into every mystery. Speedy, as his friends called him, wasn't just a vehicle. He had a full personality, complete with emotions, jealousy, and goofy commentary. He'd beep, sputter, and speak in broken words that sounded like a cross between a car engine and a nervous teenager. The strangest part wasn't just the talking car, it was how normal the humans treated him. To them, Speed Buggy was just another friend. They never questioned how or why a dune buggy had feelings. For kids, this was both hilarious and strange. Watching a car pout because he felt left out or brag because he won a race gave the show a surreal, playful charm. Looking back now, Speed Buggy feels like Hanna-Barbera trying to recycle Scooby-Doo, but accidentally creating one of the most bizarre cartoon characters of the decade. The Groovy Ghoulies, 1970. Take every famous monster you know, Frankenstein, Dracula, the Mummy, and turn them into a rock band that lives in a haunted house. That's the pitch for the Groovy Ghoulies. Instead of scaring anyone, these creatures cracked corny jokes and sang bubblegum rock songs. The main lineup included Frankie, a dim-witted Frankenstein clone, Brack, a vampire who played guitar, and Wolfie, a werewolf drummer who thought he was the coolest thing alive. Their show was filled with slapstick, music numbers, and endless monster puns. What made them bizarre was the mismatch. These were characters rooted in classic horror, yet here they were, dancing and strumming guitars like they'd joined a Saturday morning talent show. For kids, the mix was oddly entertaining. Monsters weren't frightening. Anymore, they were goofy rock stars who cared more about rhyming jokes than haunting castles. Looking back, the Ghoulies represent how the 70s turned even the scariest legends into light-hearted cartoon celebrities. Jabberjaw, 1976. Yes, another shark. But Jabberjaw wasn't just any shark, he was a 15-foot great white who sounded exactly like Curly from the Three Stooges. If that alone doesn't scream bizarre, nothing will. Jabberjaw was the drummer for a teen rock band that toured underwater cities. Yes, underwater cities. Along the way, he solved mysteries, fought villains, and complained endlessly about not getting respect. His catchphrase was literally whining about respect, long before Rodney Dangerfield made it iconic. The oddest part? He wasn't menacing at all. Despite being a giant shark, he was the comic relief. He panicked at danger, cracked bad jokes, and bumbled into victories. For viewers, Jabberjaw was bizarre because he made no sense. A shark in a rock band? Solving crimes under the sea? It was Hanna-Barbera at its most experimental, tossing ideas into a blender and hoping kids would laugh. And strangely enough, they did. Plastic Man, 1979. By the late 70s, superheroes were everywhere, but Plastic Man stood out for being both powerful and utterly ridiculous. He could stretch his body into anything, bridges, ladders, balloons, you name it. But instead of being cool and calculated, Plastic Man was a total clown. The cartoon leaned into his goofiness. He cracked jokes nonstop, tripped over his own stretching limbs, and got stuck in ridiculous shapes at the worst possible moments. Even his sidekick, Hula Hula, seemed more competent than him half the time. The bizarre part wasn't his powers, it was his personality. Most heroes saved the day with dignity. Plastic Man did it by accident, tumbling through chaos until somehow the bad guy wound up defeated. For kids, that made him strangely lovable. He wasn't polished, he wasn't graceful, but he was unforgettable. Looking back, Plastic Man feels like the 70s superhero who refused to take himself seriously. And that's exactly what makes him stand out today. Mumbly, 1976. If you thought One Dog Detective was enough, Hanna-Barbera gave you Mumbly. He was a trench coat-wearing pup with a raspy, wheezy laugh that made him sound suspiciously like Muttley from Wacky Races. But instead of being a villain's sidekick, Mumbly was now the good guy. He worked as a crime-busting detective, chasing down crooks in his own clumsy way. The catch? His laugh was so strange it sometimes felt like he was mocking the very people he was supposed to help. He'd cackle while bad guys got caught, making the whole thing feel less heroic and more awkward. The bizarre thing was how shamelessly recycled he felt. Viewers couldn't miss the resemblance to Muttley, and yet the studio never explained why this character existed as a near clone. It was like Hanna-Barbera thought kids wouldn't notice, or maybe they just didn't care. For audiences, Mumbly was strange because he was both familiar and unsettling. A detective dog that laughed at everything, even crime scenes, was hardly the model of justice. But in the 70s, he still managed to earn his own spot on Saturday mornings. Rick Springfield, Mission Magic. 1973. Yes, you heard that right. Rock singer Rick Springfield actually starred as himself in a Saturday morning cartoon. Except this version wasn't just a musician, he was a magical teacher who led kids through portals to fantasy worlds while singing his own songs. In Mission Magic, Springfield taught a group of students, and together they'd use spells to travel across time and space. 1 minute, they'd be in ancient history, the next, they'd be fighting mythical creatures, all while Rick broke into a pop tune. The bizarre part was how seriously the show treated him. He wasn't a parody. He was presented as a genuine rock star who just happened to wield magic spells on the weekend. For kids, that mix of education, music, and fantasy was confusing but oddly entertaining. Looking back, it feels like someone tried to blend a music video, a history lesson, and a Saturday morning cartoon into one package. And somehow, Rick Springfield was the glue holding it together. The Osmonds, 1972. If one music group could get their own cartoon, why not another? That was the thinking behind the Osmonds, which turned the real-life singing family into animated do-gooders. But instead of just performing, the Osmonds became a traveling band that solved mysteries and helped people between gigs. They drove around in a colorful bus, encountered villains, and of course, broke into musical numbers mid-adventure. The real Osmonds even voiced their animated counterparts, which gave the whole thing an odd mix of reality and fiction. The strangest part was how forced it felt. The mysteries weren't spooky like Scooby-Doo. They were often just excuses for the Osmonds to perform a song that somehow wrapped up the plot. For kids, it was a surreal experience, watching a famous family moonlight as cartoon superheroes with guitars. Looking back, the Osmonds was less about story and more about brand promotion, but in its weirdness, it gave Saturday mornings one of the most bizarre cartoon bands to ever hit TV. The 70s were a wild playground for animation, and these characters prove it. From sharks in bowler hats to rock stars casting spells, cartoons weren't just for laughs. They were strange, experimental, and sometimes downright confusing. But that's what made them unforgettable. So now it's your turn. Which of these bizarre characters do you actually remember watching? And which one shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more trips down the strangest corners of cartoon history. Because trust me, the weirdness doesn't end here.